Chapter 15. Union of the Dueling Hearts. It was 2 days later when the Dueling Hearts and their allies finally got together with everyone they had invited to speak with them. They met at the mall across from the Mega Dojo at 4:30 in the afternoon. Everyone came, including Joe's youngest cousin Em, and the very skeptical Robert Stone. There had been a discussion regarding whether or not to tell Em everything, but Joe made the executive decision to trust her youngest cousin with the troubling truth of the Soul Taker's existence. She knew Em well enough to know that she would be able to handle the information, but she also insisted that Em not even be asked to fight against the Soul Takers due to her age. The others, including even Lawrence, quickly agreed. Then the tent fighters sat down together. Joe and Karen took charge of describing the situation to them. They explained who the Soul Takers were, what they did, and how Joe and her Dueling Hearts had come to learn about them. Karen described their leader, the sinister head of the villainous organization. She spoke of how even just his reputation was enough to frighten even the strongest organization members into obedience, and why he was so eager to find the bearers of the fragments of the reincarnated ancient divine soul. Karen went into detail, describing that their leader had lost a serious heart-to-heart many years ago and sustained an injury to his inner soul nexus, the sort of metaphysical energy organ that allows a person to wield soul in the first place. She explained that while his unique power to take soul from others gave him the ability to treat the wound, only the ancient soul fragments could be used to heal the damage for good, and that if the damage remained, it would eventually kill him. She made it very clear that Robert, Em, and Kimmy did all have souls born of those many fragments, and that they would become targets of the Soul Takers one way or another as soon as the Soul Takers learned of that truth. By the time the two girls were finished explaining things, the group had fallen eerily silent, especially relative to the noises of the mall's food court that surrounded them. Em sat back in her chair, one of many that circled the two tables that the group had pushed together to accommodate them. She didn't seem to know what to think. Kimmy looked stunned, the color drained from her cheeks, but Robert, who had already insisted that the others call him Rocky, looked surprisingly relieved. Joe noticed this immediately, but before she could say anything, he answered her unspoken question. "Man," Rocky announced, almost laughing, "that's a load off my mind. When I saw how strong you guys were back at my dojo, I was worried that you were from the Soul Takers, trying to recruit me or something." He locked eyes with Monty, Lawrence, and Karen in turn and said, "I'm not psyched to hear that you guys used to be Soul Takers yourselves, but I can get over it if you're serious about bringing the whole organization down." "I'm surprised you knew about them already," Joe told him. "The four of us," she gestured to herself and the other Dueling Hearts, "didn't learn about the organization until we met these three." "I guess not many people would know about them," Rocky replied, "but I'm an exception. He hesitated. "I have some history with them. It's not anything worth talking about, but you can be sure that I want to bring the entire organization down if I can. It's one of the reasons I train so hard. I know they sometimes come after strong people. I wanted to be one of those people, and I wanted to be ready when they came." "This whole thing sounds impossible," Kimmy remarked. "I promise you that it's not," Monty assured her, "and it's honestly not too strange when you think about it. Soul is a powerful weapon, and groups have always attempted to use powerful weapons to expand their power." "That's not really what I find so odd," Kimmy replied. "It's that of all the people out there, we're the ones these guys are after?" Joe and the other Dueling Hearts didn't know how to respond to that. They all felt much the same way. Surprisingly, it was Tucker who spoke up. "The more I think about it," he said, "I think it's kind of a good thing that it's us. Karen says that our souls make us really powerful, and a threat to this leader guy. If we can take him down, that means he gets beaten without anyone but us needing to get hurt." Joe smiled. She was excited to see such a heroic side of her best friend. But she also realized that Tucker's words probably didn't do much to put Kimmy at ease. She added, "Whether you agree with Tucker or not, I think the sentiment stands. One of the reasons we asked you here is because we want help from the two of you. You're both strong, and there's even greater strength in numbers. But if that doesn't work for you," she assured them, "now that we know that you also have fragments of the ancient soul, we can protect you if the Soul Takers come looking." "No," Kimmy said, "that's all right. These guys are after me too. I'll fight them if I have to, and it sounds like I will have to sooner or later." "Things are leaning towards sooner," Karen explained. "A particularly powerful Soul Taker is in town, and he'll attack again any day now. It's unlikely that he's counted you two in his calculations, though, and against 9 of us, not even he stands a chance." "Did Shannon know about this?" Kimmy asked. Karen gave Joe a strange, knowing look that went unnoticed by the others. She knew just how much Shannon knew about the situation, but she didn't think it was her place to tell them Shannon's secrets. Instead, she watched and observed, curious as to how Joe would answer Kimmy's question. "No," Joe admitted. "We're worried that if she finds out, she'll try to handle things herself, and that it'll be too much for her." It was an odd thing to say. Shannon was a master. In her prime, she very likely could have given any 4 of the present fighters a run for their money all at once, at the very least. Even now, having her in their corner would have been a huge benefit, but when Kimmy pointed this out, Joe refused to entertain the idea. Circumstance had forced the Dueling Hearts into the conflict with the Soul Takers. Joe didn't intend to drag her mom into that same kind of danger. It was Rocky who decided to change the subject, alleviating the building tension. "All right," he said, "it's decided. We'll help fight the Soul Takers when we're needed, and we won't involve anyone else if we can help it. But that's no reason to stop living our lives, yeah? Joe, didn't you say there was another reason you asked us all here?" "Yeah," Joe replied, looking to Em, "and this concerns all three of you. The four of us," she gestured again to herself, Sarah, Tucker, and Jen, meeting Rocky's eyes as she explained, "are a team, the Dueling Hearts." "Yeah," Rocky interjected, "I remember that from the tournament. I didn't place the name at the time, but I've actually heard of you. You guys beat Christopher Johnson and his team a couple months back." "That's right," Tucker confirmed, beaming. "The thing is," Joe continued, "we have this sort of loose contract with ProCorp. To keep it, we have to compete in a certain number of their events. There's one this weekend, in fact, and I can't make it," Sarah admitted. "It's a team-on-team heart-to-heart," Joe explained, "so obviously we can't compete without 4 people. This is a problem that we expect to keep coming up, so we want to bring some relief fighters on board. ProCorp gave us permission for up to 6, so all 3 of you are invited to join Team Dueling Hearts if you want to." "What about them?" Em asked, leaning her seat back on 2 legs, gesturing at Karen, Monty, and Lawrence. Joe reached under the table with her foot and pushed Em's front chair legs back to the floor, and then looked at her team's enemies turned allies. She and Karen had gotten to be much more comfortable in each other's presence over the last couple of days. Joe genuinely liked the other girl and was coming to consider her a genuine friend. She thought it over and wondered why she had never even considered the possibility. It seemed obvious now, and yet it had never even crossed Joe's mind. "I guess you guys can sign on too," Joe told the former Soul Takers. "Pass," Lawrence announced immediately, but Karen rolled her eyes and shook her head, signaling to Joe not to take his answer as final. "I'm up for that," Monty decided. "Me too," Karen agreed, smiling at Joe, not in the confident, competitive way that she often did, but in the genuine way that had first convinced Joe to trust her. "Well," Joe said, making note that Tucker was very obviously biting his tongue, "I guess we have enough relief members now whether you 3 accept or not." "I'll do it," Em said with slightly more enthusiasm than Zero, which was pretty remarkable for her. "Me too," Kimmy agreed, happy to have something to think about beside the Soul Takers and the threat that they posed. "Shannon's been saying I should compete more anyway." "Yeah, I'll join," said Rocky. "Absolutely. You guys beat a guy that they call one of the best of our generation, and you have a deal with the biggest company in the world. I might have started fighting so I'd be able to protect myself and others, but a career as a fighter is as good an option for me as any." Joe smiled. This meeting had, so far, gone significantly better than she had hoped. There was only one thing left to do now. Joe, who got overloaded if she had to interact with a lot of people for too long, wasn't thrilled about her own plan, but it was still a good idea. "Okay," she told the group, "since we're all on a team now, I want us to spend some time together, to just chill out and get to know each other better. We'll stick around here for another couple hours or so, then head home." She looked over at Karen, feeling a little flustered when she remembered what home was coming to mean for the other girl, and she said, "Since you guys are Dueling Hearts now, I guess you're included in this too." The following conversation was slow to start. Kimmy actually carried most of it at first, asking the others questions. At one point, when she forgot a word in English, Monty was able to translate her Japanese, and that became a topic of conversation for a few minutes before petering out again. Eventually, the conversation did get going. Everyone present was a fighter, so they found common ground discussing fights that they'd been in and the tactics they'd used. Lawrence said very little, and he was the first person to duck out of the conversation, getting up and walking away, but moving to stand by a nearby support pillar where he could still hear what was being said. Joe was surprised that, even though he genuinely didn't seem to like any of them much, he really was trying to give this alliance a shot. Monty confirmed the suspicion that many of them had had for a while, that he injected unnecessary showmanship into his forms, and after a short debate about whether or not that was actually viable, the conversation turned to actual performers, including various singers, actors, and general pop culture stuff that Joe simply didn't have much knowledge of or interest in. By about 6 p.m., Joe excused herself as well. She went and bought some nachos from one of the food court stalls and followed Lawrence's example, leaning against a different pillar, near enough to observe the conversation, but not close enough to be roped back into it. As she grew nearer to finishing her snack, Joe looked away from her collected friends and allies so that she could focus on digging some cheese out of a troublesome groove in the plastic platter. While she did, Karen got up and approached her, announcing herself to Joe by plucking up one of the few remaining tortilla chips and popping it into her mouth. "Did you hear that?" she asked, leaning against the pillar next to the other girl. "Hear what?" Joe inquired as she chewed. "That Kimmy girl. She has a big house, 4 bedrooms, and her parents spend most of their time out of town. She offered to let me stay in one of the guest rooms. I took her up on it. I figured it's better than the two of us trading off between your bed and your sleeping bag. Yeah, Joe agreed. It is. She meant what she said. This arrangement would be significantly better for both of them. She knew that. And yet she still felt like someone had gripped her heart and given it a little squeeze. She liked having Karen around, and even though it was crazy to think so, this felt like Karen was choosing someone else over her. Karen stood there for a few more seconds, watching Joe, waiting, but Joe didn't say anything else, continuing to try and work the cheese out of its groove. Finally, Karen sighed and said, "Okay, I thought taking the pressure off of you a little would make things less awkward, but now I'm not so sure. So am I gonna have to make the first move or what?" Joe was confused. Her first thought was that Karen was talking about a heart-to-heart, so she was thrown completely off guard, more so than she'd ever been before, when Karen took the half-eaten platter of nachos from her and held it away from them both as she leaned in, kissing Joe delicately on the lips. She only lingered for a second, but to Joe, it felt like an eternity. And then it was over, and even eternity hadn't been long enough. "I'm gonna go set up my room. I'll talk to you tomorrow," Karen told her, walking away with a big smile on her face, and the rest of Joe's nachos still in her hand. Joe watched her go, transfixed, until she realized that everyone at the Dueling Hearts table was watching her. She felt her face turn beet red, mumbling something about forgetting a TV show that she wanted to watch, and scurried away as well. "Well, it's about time," said Monty, watching Joe walk away. "Karen's been thinking about doing that for days. I'm honestly surprised Joe didn't initiate things instead," Tucker added, smiling on behalf of his friend. "Just by accident, though, like by slipping up and saying the wrong thing. She's even weirder than me in social situations." Sarah sat back in her chair. "I can't believe her. Is this why she was so quick to trust them?" "Them in this context," Monty interjected, "being us." "Sorry," Sarah told him, though the harshness of her gaze made the sincerity of her words questionable. "But Joe was the one we looked to when we were deciding whether or not to trust you guys. It turned out all right, at least so far, but it still kind of pisses me off a little to know that I didn't have all the information." "I did, though," Tucker assured her. "I know Joe well enough to see that her and Karen have a thing. But I also know Joe well enough to know that she'll be even more careful about believing what Karen says if she has feelings for her." "That's smart," Lawrence said from his perch several feet away, just loudly enough for the others to hear and subsequently ignore him. "I agree with Tucker," Jen remarked. "Joe is the kind of person who, if she thought her emotions were affecting her judgment, would overcompensate in the other direction." "Yeah, that," Tucker said, nodding his agreement. "Did you know about this too?" Sarah asked her indignantly. "I had a suspicion," Jen answered. "Great," Sarah replied. "So she's my sister, and I'm the only one who didn't know." Of course she wasn't. Kimmy, Rocky, and Em hadn't known about Joe's feelings for Karen either, simply by virtue of not having spent much time in the presence of the two girls. Thankfully, they didn't complicate the conversation by chiming in, although Rocky did notice that Kimmy was beaming at the place where Joe and Karen had just been. He wondered if she was one of those hopeless romantic types. She seemed like she might be, as cheerful as she always was. Cheerful and cute. Rocky almost couldn't believe it, but he liked Kimmy. Quite a lot, in fact. It was everything from the look of her smile and the sound of her voice, all the way up to how sincerely and genuinely positive she was about things. He always tried to be like that, but he often failed, so he admired anyone who didn't. He found the whole situation surprising. He didn't get like this often, and hardly ever with anyone he'd just met. He wondered briefly if he should ask her out. They'd be seeing a lot of each other in the near future, but that didn't really sway his thinking either way. If they did have chemistry, it would almost be better to know as soon as possible, since that would change their dynamic on the team. But if he asked her out and things didn't go well, things would get awkward. With the departure of Joe and Karen, the meetup lost steam pretty quickly. Most of the Dueling Hearts needed to take buses home, Jen and Em being the only exceptions, so the group decided as a whole to part ways and make their way toward the two nearby stops. Buses to their respective home neighborhoods would be arriving relatively soon. Tucker, Sarah, Monty, and Lawrence all made their way toward the more north of the stops, Sarah and Tucker walking together, Lawrence walking several feet behind them, and Monty sort of keeping to the middle. Meanwhile, Rocky and Kimmy walked toward the other stop, located in the southeast of the mall parking lot. Rocky wondered if the fact that they were catching the same bus meant that they actually lived near each other. Still wrestling with the question of whether or not he should just say something to Kimmy about his attraction to her, Rocky made an impulsive decision against his better judgment. He did a sort of speed walk up to her side. "Hey," he said tentatively, running his fingers nervously through his hair. "That was pretty fun, right? I don't meet new people often, but I think we all really hit it off. But I was wondering, you and me, maybe." "I'm sorry," Kimmy interjected, and it was clear that she was, in fact, sorry about what she was going to say. "I can tell where this is going. Listen, Robbie." Rocky mumbled. "It's Rocky, actually." Kimmy looked over at him. "I thought your name was Robert. Robert is shortened to Robbie, right?" Usually, Rocky replied, hoping desperately that he could distract her from finishing her rejection of him so he could just pretend like he'd never said anything. But my soul is an earth soul, so people started calling me Rocky. Well, I'm going to call you Robbie, Kimmy told him, and she waited to see if he would object. He honestly didn't mind, and claiming otherwise to prolong this tangent would be dishonest, so he didn't say anything. Listen, Robbie, Kimmy continued. The thing is, I'm only in the country to train under Shannon. My parents mostly do business back home in Japan. That's why they're away so much. They let me live here so I can train, but once I'm out of high school, my training will be far enough along that I can complete it on my own. My parents want me to return to Japan for college, she explained. So I don't really want to get too attached to anyone here, and I think I could probably get really attached to you. But, she added hastily when she saw the dejected look on Rocky's face, that doesn't mean I don't need friends while I'm here. I don't really have anyone, so maybe we can try being friends instead? Rocky was hurt for sure, but he understood Kimmy's reasoning, and she sounded so sincere about wanting to be friends that it didn't seem like he'd made things awkward between them yet. If he pushed her away now, that would change, so he made the conscious choice not to make the situation any worse. He smiled as genuinely as he could and said, Yeah, for sure, but maybe not today if that's alright. Kimmy nodded. Yeah, okay. We have that team match coming this weekend, right? Maybe we can hang out a little bit after? Sounds good, Rocky replied, and he smiled again. This time he didn't have to force it so much. The bus arrived, and the two new Dueling Hearts climbed on board. They were still just uncomfortable enough that they didn't want to sit together, but neither of them was resentful of the other. The more Rocky thought about it, the more excited he was to have someone as sweet and happy as Kimmy for a friend. He wasn't close to many people either, after all. This won't be so bad, he told himself, pretending that he wasn't lying to himself, his heart aching unpleasantly, unaware of the similar ache in his new friend's chest. Bonus! The Mechanics of Soul, Part 2. Offensive uses for soul. There are several ways to make soul into a weapon. Firstly, and most simply, any kind of soul can be applied to a body, and as long as that body's own soul is compatible with it, that body will become stronger and faster. People with awakened souls also gain the ability to manipulate objects and energies which are sympathetic to their soul's new energy patterns. For example, a gravity soul produces energy fields which resemble gravity, a fire soul creates fire, and a magnetic soul creates magnetic fields. These energies can be enhanced with soul, but are not technically soul themselves, and can bypass some of soul's usual restrictions. Soul itself can also be turned outward as a weapon. Raw soul, that being the soul produced naturally in the bodies of people with unawakened souls, can be patterned through concentration and the movement of the body to produce various effects, even elemental ones. This is how realistic weapons made from soul and avatars that are just a larger version of the fighter's own body are created. A large concentration of raw soul, focused into a point, interacts with the air and creates plasma, which is hot and holds an electrical charge, making it inherently damaging. That damage can then be inflated with the application of more soul. The resulting plasma also packs a physical punch, being something with physical presence in the real world, and someone with a rare electrical-based awakened soul can inflate the inherent electrical charge of this plasma by magnitudes. With practice, this principle can be used to produce blasts with force proportional to the amount of soul used, or highly focused blasts with many times more power than that. Someone with an awakened soul can obviously imbue these same offensive options with their soul's unique properties with just a little more effort, but some awakened soul properties are harder to translate to offense than others, being more suited to movement or defense, like Joe's shadow soul. Fighters with those kinds of awakened souls will sometimes still channel raw soul into weapons and blasts when they need it in combat. This takes even more practice, though, as summoning up raw soul is not intuitive anymore when your soul has awakened. Some fighters will simply never be good at it. Jen, for example, is such a fighter. She can create destructive energy blasts with raw soul, but they aren't very powerful. She would have to accompany them with some additional force to make them effective. Jo, on the other hand, is quite good at this due to how volatile her soul is. While she builds power, she actually overwhelms the ability of her internal soul nexus to convert soul into shadow soul, leaving her with a lot of raw soul to shape into things like soul breakers, though a lot of that soul will dissipate if she doesn't make an aura to contain it. Meanwhile, Sarah, as someone who had to use her soul sparingly for a long time, still hasn't learned the full scope of her soul's unique properties yet. She could theoretically create blasts of raw soul, and she may be able to create water from her soul the way Tucker creates fire. But for now, she prefers to use physical instances of her elements as weapons. And, speaking of Tucker, his fire soul is particularly well suited to offense. He's never needed to use raw soul as an offensive option, so he just never really bothered to learn how. Sending a lot of soul out into the world to produce large-scale effects takes time. Sarah, for example, would need to send her soul further and further to bring large amounts of water to her all at once, and she would have to defend herself without water until then. This is often why she calls upon just enough water to supplement her other efforts. To get around this, drawing from similar principles to the ones talked about in The Mechanics of Soul Part 1, some fighters pattern their soul into circles that magnify the soul used to create them, enhancing their effects beyond what would normally be possible with the amount of soul used. The circle still takes time to make, but the effect that it produces occurs faster than it would if the circle weren't used at all. Jen's gravity sigils are examples of this. Finally, there is one other way to use soul as a weapon, one that was only ever fully understood by one of the legendary Six Masters. This person discovered that the soul that people generate comes from another place, another dimension, and that the process of pulling it into our reality changes it from its true natural state. That this is true of people with natural or unnatural souls, or awakened or unawakened souls. It's an unavoidable process that limits how much soul can be bent to someone's will. He created a very special technique that molds part of the person's internal soul into a blade that responds to a person's very will, bypassing this limitation and imbuing the blade with the full, broad properties inherent to this natural form of soul. He taught this technique to a few people, but they have had trouble conveying it to others, as he never actually explained to them how it works. Now, in order for the technique to be passed on further, the student must see the technique in use and learn to mimic it by look and feel alone. Then, once they master it, they can apply their awakened soul to it and make it something truly unique to themselves. It is considered by many to be the most versatile soul technique ever devised.